It disappeared almost in an instant when Craig Newmark started Craigslist. It was free, on the web, and sortable. Uh, Add to that corporate greed, consolidation by chains like Gannett Media, which took on a lot of debt and have laid off journalists, sold buildings, closed down papers, and created ghost papers with no staff.
Hey there, I'm Kimberly Atkins Stohr, and welcome to Justice by Design, the podcast that takes a look at the problems that we face as a society and talks to the people who are finding real solutions for them. And one thing that people who have listened to this podcast or who follow me on social media know is how deeply I care about not just the news industry writ large, which I do, but particularly local news. I am lucky enough to have spent most of my career at local and regional publications, and I know the importance of them, but they're also facing a really, really hard time right now. And that's why I'm so thrilled to be joined today by two people who are doing very good work in this space. Ellen Clegg and Dan Kennedy, of co-authors of the book What Works in Community News, Media Startups, News Deserts, and the Future of the Fourth Estate. Ellen and Dan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So I want to give each of you a chance to introduce yourselves a little bit and to introduce the What Works project, which is much more than a book. Why don't you start with you, Dan?
Well, I am a professor in the journalism school at Northeastern University, and before that I spent many years as the media columnist for the late, much-lamented Boston Phoenix, which was our big alternative weekly here in Boston. And I have been looking at the local news crisis and possible solutions to it for probably the last 15 years now. This is my third book on the topic. And I have always been optimistic, mainly because of the incredible people who I've met at the grassroots level, entrepreneurs and thought leaders who are figuring out how to solve the crisis, one community at a time. And I should say that my co-author is one of the people who's involved in directly solving that crisis. So take it away, Ellen.
Well, we hope. I spent 37 years at the Boston Globe, a successful regional paper. At the Globe, I led an expansion into the communities surrounding Boston, Globe North, Globe South, Globe West. Those sections were based on a print ad model and no longer exist. But I got a real feel for local news. I left daily journalism. I retired in 2018 and joined Dan in this book project. I remember, Dan, in your office at Northeastern, we sketched out thriving projects that we wanted to include in this book project. That was in 2019. The pandemic intervened, but we managed to touch down in each community we covered and do extensive interviews. I got so inspired by this movement and by people I met that I joined a group of former colleagues, business people in Brookline, a suburb adjacent to Boston, town of 65,000, and started Brookline.news in 2023. It's a nonprofit. We are funded by our donors, by some grant money. We do a few events, and I'm happy to say we're thriving. We have 3 paid employees.
Wow, that's really great. And in full disclosure, and I know listeners may begin to think that I just started this podcast to invite people who I know and used to work with on the show to talk to them. But it just so happens that I know and have worked with a lot of people who are doing really interesting, innovative things. I know Dan from back in his days at the Boston Phoenix, and Ellen actually was my editor. I was part of that local regional launch that the Globe did covering the South Shore was my first real journalism job. But I want to talk about this because at that time, when I first started in journalism in Boston, you had these two pretty robust papers. It was a two newspaper town. I worked at the Herald as well as the Globe, and there was also the Phoenix. There was the Weekly Dig. There was all of these publications that really created this nice, robust local news uh, atmosphere that I really enjoyed, but that is becoming so much more rare. Ellen, I'm going to start with you. Can you just give our listeners an idea as to why it has become so hard for local and regional news, mostly local and community news uh, organizations to survive, let alone thrive?
Well, as we've all been through the digital disruption that started really in the mid aughts with the rise of the internet. But that's not the only issue at play. There was a collapse in print advertising, particularly in classifieds, and some 40% of the Globe's revenue was from those small ads, help wanted, pet for sale, in small type in the back of the paper. When I was Sunday editor at the Globe, each page of classified advertising brought in about $60,000 in revenue. The Globe Sunday edition would publish 120 pages. That revenue fed the newsroom. It allowed us to have at one point 500 journalists in our newsroom, and that disappeared in almost an instant when Craig Newmark started Craigslist. It was free, on the web, and sortable. Add to that corporate greed, consolidation by chains like Gannett Media, which took on a lot of debt and have laid off journalists, sold buildings, closed down papers, and created ghost papers with no staff.
Yeah, I mean, really, one of the animating principles that Ellen and I are working on is that even though the newspaper business, and I talk about newspapers, but mainly what we're talking about these days, of course, is digital, even though they have faced very real challenges posed by technology and cultural change, they're still producing revenues. And if those remaining revenues weren't being shipped out of town in order to pay down debt and enrich corporate shareholders, there would be money in order to create a better consumer experience. Mm-hmm. I mean, the technology at a lot of these local news outlets is terrible. Maintain some of the journalism. And so what we did was we headed out to 9 different regions of the country to look at independent news operations that don't have to worry about these corporate pressures to earn, and are really reinventing local journalism from the bottom up. And what we found is just very encouraging in community after community.
So before we get to dig in a little bit more about what is working in these publications, I just want to talk a little bit more to help people understand about how difficult it is for local news, not just the loss of all that advertising money, but even public media, public radio and television, which I also am an alumnus of, and care about that, or nonprofits are having a difficult time too. I feel as you were talking about all of the factors that are against small local businesses, I feel like all of them has touched me. I've previously worked for a Gannett paper, which is a shell of itself now. I previously worked for the Boston Herald, which was bought up by a venture capitalist firm, and it bears no resemblance to the paper that I used to work for. The other community papers that I was talking to no longer exist. Just get a sense. I know a lot of times people say, well, what can we do to save journalism? And my answer is always subscribe to local news, and people don't want it or they don't understand its importance. And I always say what's going on in your community will affect you far more than anything that is happening here in Washington, where I sit, where I'm covering here. Can you just talk a little bit more about not just the struggles of local news, but the importance of it?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would say, You should subscribe to your local news outlet, even if it's corporate owned, if it's giving you value.
Mm.
But if your corporate owned paper is no longer giving you any value, what you should be doing is getting together with your neighbors and friends and starting something on your own.
Mm.
Um, by one widely cited study, about 3,300 newspapers have closed since 2005. That's about a third of the total. Most of them were weeklies, and those are the papers where um, the most basic elements of community life are covered: city council, town board, school committee, things like that. And in addition to the very real struggles that we are talking about, most of these papers have been acquired by corporate chains, hedge funds, and in recent years, as they have reached the point where they have wrung out just about all of the revenues that they can wring out, they've started closing and merging them. What happens when this takes place in a community? Well, we've looked at a number of academic studies. Our book is not academic. We did on the
Right.
ground reporting, but we surveyed academic studies, and I can talk about a couple, and Ellen can talk about a couple. But one thing I would point to is that studies show trust in news is much higher at the local level than it is at the national level.
Mm.
And so when you lose that local news, people end up fighting over things that they've seen on cable news. And that isn't healthy for communities, and it's not healthy for society. Another thing that happens when local news disappears is that fewer people run for local office. Voter turnout goes down. You are more likely to vote a straight party ticket because
Yep.
you really haven't heard of anybody below maybe the level of mayor. And those are a couple of studies, and I think Ellen's got a couple of good ones too.
We reviewed one study done by a political science professor who's now at Syracuse University, and he worked with a Gannett paper in California and decided to do a 1 month experiment. He asked the editor of the editorial page to remove all syndicated national columns, no national news. This was during the Trump and Hillary Clinton's 2016 election. So for 1 month, they solicited guest essays from local people about local issues. In California, those include wildfires, climate change, water issues, zoning issues. And then this professor, Josh Dar, and his colleagues went into the field and did a survey, and they found that the partisan temperature had gone down a bit, that people uh, felt some commonalities with their neighbors, that they were more informed about local issues. And, we live our lives locally. And in
Mm-hmm.
Brookline, uh, readers of our digital site, which is free, nonprofit, they see me in the grocery store. They see me at the farmer's market. They see our reporters at meetings, and they can react and talk. People call me up. And the heavily partisan issues that are driven by cable news do local issues do not map neatly onto the red-blue divide. People have nuanced positions, and we hope by reflecting that we can rebuild community.
That's so true. Having been lucky enough to work for many years in the local space, covering school boards, board of selectmen meetings, people from Massachusetts understand what that is. You know, small school boards in New York, up north of the city, and communities there, you do learn so much more, but you learn the interaction of people between people and the media is very, very different. And people really appreciate when the things that they care about are being covered. And it's important for journalists to understand. When I was first working at Globe South, Ellen, I remember I was going to a Board of Selectmen meeting in Milton about a proposal to make a small section of a street one way. And I thought, really, this is what I went to Columbia Journalism School. This is what I went to Columbia Journalism School to do. And I get to this meeting and it is standing room only. There's an overflow room. Like, people in Milton were hot about this. And it was important. And it actually produced some really good journalism about what was going on there. And I learned a lot about that community as a reporter. And so, yeah, local news is really crucially important for people. So I want to get to the money, because that's what a lot of this boils down to. I get the number one comment I get on social media when I post a column is paywall, can't read it, because the Boston Globe has found that to make up for all that Craigslist stolen ad revenue, they have doubled down and done a model that makes it one of the few profitable newspapers in the country, really focusing on subscribers and putting out good content so that subscribers come back. And that seems to be working, but that doesn't work for everybody. Talk about what works in local news. You talk about things that are nonprofit or public, even public radio. My alma mater, WBUR, is suffering. How do you pay for local news to keep it afloat?
Well, let me maybe one of the ways to do that is for Alan and I to each talk about one of the projects that we reported on.
Please do that.
And one of the projects that I reported on was the Colorado Sun, which has had a very interesting trajectory since it was founded in 2017, 2018. I forget. It's in the book. The Colorado Sun was founded by 10 of the top editors and reporters at the Denver Post, which had been really ripped apart by cut after cut after cut at the hands of its hedge fund owner, Alden Global Capital. So one of the things that we've really enjoyed about looking at the Sun is that they've been very nimble and have changed their business model several times in response to changing opportunities. The Sun actually began as thinking that they were going to be funded by some sort of a crypto arrangement, and they were going to be published on the blockchain. And when I asked their founder and editor, Larry Rickman, what that meant, I'm not sure whether he was unable to explain it or whether I was just too dense to understand what he was telling me. But I have to say, the crypto scheme went the way of all crypto schemes, kind of leaving them in the lurch, although they did get some crucial startup money out of it. So I don't want to be completely dismissive of that. Their next step was to become a for-profit public benefit company. Now, a public benefit corporation is a special designation that requires you to serve the public in some way, some measurable way, even though you are a for-profit. And at the same time, they developed a relationship with a nonprofit, and people could give money to the nonprofit, tax deductible, and that money could be used to support certain types of public interest journalism at the Colorado Sun, which remained for profit. And that worked well for them for a few years until finally, about a year ago, they decided to go fully nonprofit. And when I asked Larry Rickman why he did that, and why he felt the need to do it after our book came out, he said it was just becoming too complicated a story to tell. He says, we were telling people, okay, you can give us money directly, but you can also give to the nonprofit. And he said, let's just simplify it and go fully nonprofit. And it paid off for them fairly quickly. They recently reported receiving a pretty substantial grant that probably wouldn't have been available to them if they were still a for-profit.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just say one more thing about the business model, because most of the projects we looked at were nonprofit. Frankly, we would like to see more for-profits, but that's just very difficult in this environment. nonprofits tend to try to build a three-legged stool for themselves. One of those legs is contributions from readers. Generally speaking, these sites do not have paywalls, but they ask people to support them. Sometimes there is a tote bag or something in it for them if they do that, sometimes not. Uh, Another leg of the stool is large gifts, foundations, things like that. High net worth individuals, which I've learned is nonprofit speak for rich people. And then you try to develop a third leg, and this is hard, but it's really important. A third leg of earned income. And by earned income, that's everything else. Nonprofits can take advertising. Most of them do, although it tends not to be as significant a part of their revenue stream as is the case with a for-profit. And events. And events are done in various ways. They can be paid events. They can be sponsored events. But if you can have events, not only does that give you a better opportunity to connect with your community, but it can be a moneymaker as well. And that is probably the perfect segue to a terrific event that Ellen helped organize recently.
Yeah, the
It's like you
three-legged
guys have done this before.
Just a few times.
I should say for my listeners, they also have a podcast, which is called What Works, that you should also subscribe to. But go ahead, Ellen.
All right. The three-legged stool is an important model, and at Brookline.News, that's important for us. We have individual donors. We have some generous high wealth individuals who've given very generously. We also have some sponsors. A couple of real estate agents in town sponsor our newsletter, and we had a great success when we tried our first event, a moth-like story slam called at Coolidge Corner Theater, a nonprofit theater in the center of Brookline. We lined up speakers, local speakers, to tell about their lives. We supplied coaching. It was an all-volunteer effort. We priced the tickets at $25 with scholarships available, and we sold out the Coolidge in one day, 400 people.
Wow.
It built, the energy in the room was fantastic. The reader engagement was really energizing and inspiring, and subscriptions for a for-profit entity like the Boston Globe are a sign of reader engagement. Which is the coin of the realm now. It's all about finding your audience, meeting your audience, and tracking what your audience wants.
Yeah. So I know I've definitely talked to Dan a little bit about this, but we're talking about the importance of information and being what you were describing as a not a low information voter. You're saying people don't know, they can't keep track of what their school board or local city council is doing. And so when they go to the polls to vote for someone, they really don't know, or they don't know what initiative or a ballot question might be. To me, that's the definition of a low information voter. It has nothing to do with presidential races with people who have the highest name recognition of anybody. That's not it. It's that. But how we get our information has changed so much. I feel like, particularly after an election, it seems like voters, when you talk to them, they are all living in their own individual worlds with their own individually curated bits of information. So talk about, as a tool of democracy, whether it's community news or bigger papers like the Globe, which is not, none of this conversation applies to a paper like the Globe that, had the benefit, in addition to having good readership and subscription, being purchased by a billionaire. Like we are in a different, we are in a different field. But talk about how having that information is important for democracy to function, and how we can ensure that people get better information. I'll
Well,
start with
you
I'll
you
go. You
you
go ahead, Dan.
you talk about the Globe not necessarily being in this category, but one of the projects that Ellen reported on is almost a sister paper to the Boston Globe, the Minnesota Star Tribune,
Hmm.
and they are just incredibly important to the
Yes.
democratic governance of Minnesota.
And I will say, like, even when I graduated from journalism school, which is now over 20 years ago, which I can't believe, um, that was for students, at Columbia Journalism School. That would have been a fantastic place to land. The Dallas Morning News was seen as like a star. So many newspapers that were seen, uh, Chicago Tribune, that were just places you were dying to go. I, of course, was dying to go to the Globe, and ambushed the recruiter in order to get an internship there. But these were papers that were on par with each other, right? And some have not survived, and some have suffered tremendously. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Dan, but that's an important point.
No, I was just trying to get Ellen to talk about the Star Tribune.
Where I was a summer intern, by the way, at the Minneapolis Tribune
Oh, there you go.
many, many years ago. But the Star Tribune, now known as the Strib, was owned by the Coles family for many years, a really great owner. They also owned the Des Moines Register, which was another destination paper. And the Coles family sold in the 90s at the height of the market to McClatchy, which is a chain that accrued an enormous amount of debt to buy this paper. It threw it into bankruptcy. It went through a succession of big problems, multiple layoffs, and retrenchment. Minnesota has, I think, the highest voter turnout in the country, by the way. And it has a high rate of literacy statewide, even though it's partly rural, partly urban. And a billionaire bought the Star Tribune. He owns the Timberwolves and the Lynx basketball teams, and installed smart leadership, a very smart publisher, great editing, and they added content. They resumed covering the state as a whole. They've won several Pulitzer Prizes. There is now a new publisher who came from Silicon Valley, came back home to Minnesota. He is expanding statewide because he believes, as some publishers do, that fact-based journalism is especially needed in rural communities, in the tiny dots on the map,
Yeah.
where conspiracy theories can bloom on Facebook. It's a success story, much like the Globe, but also rescued by a billionaire owner.
Yeah.
One other destination paper when I was in journalism school, at University of Missouri, was the Memphis Commercial Appeal. And so I went to Memphis. The Commercial Appeal, I would have loved to have worked there. It had a newsroom of 250 journalists covering a complex and interesting city of 650,000 people. The Commercial Appeal newsroom is now down to about 30 journalists,
Oh, wow.
covering a city the size of Boston. And there are two thriving startups there. MLK 50, started by Wendy C. Thomas. It's not an advocacy site, but it focuses tightly on housing and poverty and employment. There's another pop-up site called the Daily Memphian. These are both digital. The Memphian is more of a complete bundle. They have a sports reporter, a well-known sports columnist. They cover arts and entertainment. Together, those startup newsrooms have more journalists than the Commercial Appeal, the legacy paper.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I believe that I was just reading a piece uh, from that publication about the recent, and this is national news, about the recent DOJ report on police brutality against Black residents in Memphis. Uh, and so it is important. It touches on everything. not just what is going on in your local community, but what that means more broadly to the nation and the world. And that's so important. So my last question for you guys is a question that I get all the time. What can we do? I say subscribe to your local news organization wherever you are. I stress that it doesn't have to be the Globe, but particularly when people say, I can't read this because of a paywall, I say, you don't have to subscribe to the Globe, which has a very generous $1 introductory rate, by the way. But subscribe to where you get your news and support that. What, besides that, can people do to help protect local news?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm giving an advertisement to the Globe, but even if you pay the full non-discount rate of $30 a month, which is one of the highest rates that any newspaper charges in the country, it's still just $1 a day.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it would seem to me that that is worth it if you want to be informed about what's going on in your region and state. That's a really great question, Kim, because not everybody can found a local news site in their community the way that Ellen did. That's a hard thing to do. And if you are not being well served, um, let me think about that.
Yeah.
One of the things
That'll
that
be your next
Ellen and I,
book.
yeah, that'll be our next book. What you can do. Actually, it's not a bad idea. Um,
You can
what,
write the foreword, Kim.
Okay. Done.
one of the phenomena that we discovered, and not terribly surprising, is that affluent suburban communities largely have this problem covered. This
Mm.
is where so many of the community nonprofits have started, and they're doing terrific work. Um, Urban communities of color and rural communities
Yes.
are not being as well served, and it's a more difficult nut to crack. Um, I
And that's an
hate to,
important point too, because and I left out other publications and bought like the Bay State Banner and there's a Baltimore Banner here closer to the DMV where I live, and these are crucially important publications too. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Dan.
no, that's right, and that's why publications like MLK 50 in Memphis and Sahan Journal in
Mhm.
Minnesota, which we didn't mention, are so important. Sahan Journal covers the African diaspora in Minnesota and does really remarkable work. But this is maybe where talk about government assistance comes in. And it's a fraught topic because we all know that it's hard to do the sort of independent accountability journalism that you need to do if you're getting help from the government.
Yeah.
But there are ideas that are distant enough that kind of ensure the independence while still giving some help to local news. Tax credits for publishers to hire and retain journalists,
Mm.
tax credits to businesses that advertise in local journalism. Um, a mandate that they tried in New York City a couple of years ago that a certain amount of city advertising has to go into um, local papers that serve underrepresented communities. These are steps that can be taken. I think that there's been talk of doing some of this at the federal level for several years and nothing ever happens.
Yeah.
And that's probably only going to get worse. But it would be great to see a lot of this starting to happen at the state level.
Yeah, and that doesn't make it, just to be clear, that doesn't turn these publications into state-run media or anything like that. The government
No.
invests in all kinds of industries that it is important to keep strong
Yes.
in order to have a well-functioning society. So this is not anything different than that. Ellen, how about you? What can be done?
Well, I think the state model is a good one, a good aspiration. California has a great model. The state of California has invested millions in a fund that's administered by the University of California at Berkeley Journalism School to pay stipends of young reporters who are graduating who agree to work in community news. That's one model. I also think philanthropy can play a role. I've interviewed founders of color who have had trouble getting traction with some of the major philanthropic organizations. And I think people are beginning to realize more of the issues of the that block people from startups and
Mm-hmm.
are making some effort to address it. I think much more could be done.
Yeah. Well, I wish we had so much more time to talk about this because this is an issue that is not just important generally, but it's deeply, deeply important to me. And so I'm so thankful to you both for taking the time to talk to me today. Thank you, Ellen Clegg, and thank you, Dan Kennedy.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kim.
This is such an important conversation to me because, as some of you know, I did not set out to be a journalist. I thought I was going to be a lawyer. I went to law school. I practiced law. And along the way, I had written for my local paper in college, my school paper in college, and just enjoyed it and didn't love being a lawyer and missed journalism so much. It really felt like a calling for me, and it always has. And at a time that it's under increasing threat, not just in terms of difficulty staying afloat for these local papers, but um, unprecedented attacks from the outside, including by members of the government. Um, Survival of good journalism is so important to me, and I believe that it is very much important to our democracy. We can't be a a public that makes good decisions if we're not a well-informed public. So I am deeply, deeply grateful to Dan and Ellen for the work that they are doing and all of the people in these innovative local news outlets that are bringing you the news that you need to know. I'm Kimberly Atkins Stohr, and thank you for joining me on Justice by Design. You should follow me wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode of me talking to some of the innovators that make our world better. You can also find me on YouTube. You can find all the links in the show notes, and I will see you next week.